In the dim light of a winter barn, Gunnar Olavsen meticulously prepares his livestock for the coming snow. He is joined by companions who must trade their rigid schedules and scientific precision for the intuitive warmth of a wood stove and shared stories. Listen as the rhythmic sounds of the countryside and the glow of the fire invite a deep, enveloping stillness. 1. The low, resonant hum of Gunnar Olavsen's throat vibrated through the soles of his boots, a sound less like a song and more like the idling of a well-tended cast-iron stove. He was bent double over the calf's stall, his fingers buried deep in the gold-threaded depths of the bedding. The calf, a heavy-lidded creature of cream and cinnamon, let out a long, wet sigh that puffed a cloud of steam into the dim light of the barn. Gunnar didn't look up, he was listening to the straw. He could feel the way the stalks leaned, the pockets where the air stagnated, and the precise points where the animal's weight had compressed the loft into a dense, cold mat. He shifted a handful of hay with a slow, deliberate sweep, ensuring the fibers interlaced like a woven carpet. Then he saw it. A single piece of straw, an errant golden needle, protruded at a sharp, jagged angle near the calf's left flank. It was a minute imperfection, a tiny splinter of chaos in a sanctuary of order, but to Gunnar it was a scream in the silent room. He froze. His rhythmic nodding ceased. He reached out with a precision that bordered on the surgical, his fingertips grazing the stalk. He didn't simply push it down, he nudged it, millimeter by millimeter, adjusting the angle to align perfectly with the surrounding grain. He shifted his weight, squinting through his glasses, then shifted it again. He spent 5 minutes in this frozen state of adjustment, his breath rhythmic and shallow, until the straw lay flush, disappearing into the collective golden sea. Only then did he allow himself a slow, satisfied blink. High above, perched on a rough-hewn oak beam that smelled of a century of dust and old linseed oil, Saffron watched. The cat was a smudge of ginger and cream against the shadows, her tail draped over the edge like a discarded piece of velvet ribbon. She didn't meow. She didn't even shift her weight. She simply blinked, a slow, heavy-lidded judgment that spanned the distance from the rafters to the floor. From her vantage point, the thermal map of the barn was visible in the way the air shimmered. She could see the heat rising in lazy, amber plumes from the livestock, and she noted with a flick of her ear that Gunnar's obsession with the single straw was a poor allocation of time. The thermal efficiency of the calf's stall was adequate, but the overall geometry of the room was lagging. Saffron let out a short, melodic chirp, a sound of mild critique, and began to knead the rough wood of the beam with her paws, her claws sinking into the grain in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Gunnar ignored the chirp, though he felt it in the marrow of his bones. He straightened his back, the vertebrae popping with a series of soft clicks, and closed his eyes. He reached out with his Hygge magic, not as a spell, but as an extension of his own skin. He let his consciousness expand, drifting away from his physical form to map the invisible currents of the barn. He felt the radiating warmth of the sleeping cows, the damp heat of the compost pile in the corner, and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the livestock's hearts. But as his awareness drifted toward the north wall, he hit a wall of invisible ice. A draft, thin as a razor and twice as cold, was leaking through a hairline fracture in the timber. The temperature in that specific corner was 2 degrees lower than the rest of the room. To a human, it was nothing. To a Nissi, dedicated to the art of the slumber, it was a catastrophe. He frowned, his lips curving into a tight line. He had a mental timeline for the night's wind down, a precise sequence of oiling the lamps, checking the grain bins, and finally settling into his own woolen nook, and he was already falling behind. The straw alignment had cost him precious minutes, and now the north corner demanded his intervention. He moved toward the chill, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. He didn't rush. Rushing created turbulence in the air, and turbulence was the enemy of peace. Instead, he moved with a gliding motion, his hands already beginning to trace a pattern in the air to coax the warmth from the center of the room toward the perimeter. As he passed the second stall, he paused to check the breathing of a senior heifer. He leaned in, his head tilting in a slow, rhythmic nod that synchronized with the animal's deep, cavernous inhalations. He could feel the heifer's contentment, a thick, syrupy emotion that tasted of clover and summer rain. He added a few more tufts of wool-blend bedding around her hocks, his movements fluid and repetitive. The hum in his throat shifted pitch, descending from a low drone to a rich, vibrating bass. It was a frequency designed to settle the nerves, a sonic blanket that wrapped around the animals and urged their muscles to let go of the day's tension. He spent a long time in the north corner, weaving a subtle barrier of warmth using a series of slow, circular gestures. He didn't use a wand or an incantation, he simply breathed into the space, imagining the air thickening into a plush, invisible curtain. He worked until the chill vanished, replaced by a soft, enveloping stillness. By the time he stepped back, the barn had entered a state of profound equilibrium. The livestock were no longer merely sleeping. They were submerged in a collective hibernation, their dreams synchronized by the low-frequency vibration Gunnar continued to emit. The air felt heavy, like a warm quilt pulled up to the chin, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic thrum of the valley's heartbeat. Gunnar paused, his chest expanding with a deep, cleansing breath. He reached into the pocket of his waistcoat and produced a small gray wool cloth. He removed his glasses, the lenses slightly fogged from the humidity of the barn, and began to polish them. He did so with a rhythmic, circular motion, his eyes half closed, savoring the silence he had engineered. He felt the weight of the night pressing against the barn walls. The vast, cold expanse of the Norwegian valley held at bay by the sturdy timber and his own quiet vigilance. He was a guardian of the small things, a curator of comfort, and in this moment the world was exactly as it should be. Then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden, sharp drop in pressure that made the hair on his arms stand up. A jagged spike of cold sliced through the warmth he had so meticulously cultivated, a reminder that nature does not negotiate with comfort. Gunnar looked up, his glasses still held aloft in his hand. High above, in the gap between the rafters where the moonlight bled through in silver slivers, a single snowflake descended. It didn't fall with the wind, it drifted with a slow, purposeful elegance, spinning once, twice, and then descending through the still air of the barn. It landed with an impossible lightness right in the center of the gray polishing cloth. Gunnar froze. He stared at the crystal, a perfect, six-sided star of ice that refused to melt immediately. It was a herald. The first snow of the deep winter had arrived, and it had bypassed every defense he had built. He studied the snowflake, then at the sleeping animals, and finally at Saffron, who had stopped her kneading and was now staring intently at the rafters. The tranquility remained, but the nature of it had changed. The cozy sanctuary was no longer just a place of rest, but a fortress under siege by the coming frost. He gripped the cloth tighter, the cold of the single flake seeping through the wool and touching his skin, a tiny, freezing promise of the long night to come. Chapter 2. Nia held the edge of the wool blanket with a grip that suggested she was measuring a blueprint rather than a textile. It was a massive thing, a deep indigo weave that smelled of lanolin and old cedar, heavy enough to press the breath from a person if dropped suddenly. She didn't just unfold it, she deployed it. Her fingers moved in a series of sharp, calculated increments, checking the tension of the fabric against the air, her mind clearly running a mental ledger of thermal coefficients and heat retention ratios. She stepped back, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the gap between the livestock's flanks and the drafty perimeter of the stall, calculating the exact square footage required to eliminate the cold bleed. "The density of the weave is impressive," Nia said, her voice a melodic, rhythmic cadence that cut through the stillness. "But if the layering isn't precise, we'll create air pockets. Air is an insulator, yes, but unplanned pockets lead to uneven heat distribution. We need a geometric overlap of exactly 3 inches at every seam to ensure a sealed thermal envelope." Gunnar approached her not with a step, but with a slow, drifting presence, his low hum vibrating in the air like a distant beehive. He didn't interrupt her calculations with words. Instead, he simply moved into the space beside her, his movements mirroring the slow, rhythmic nodding of his head. He reached out, his hand grazing the indigo wool. He didn't check the tension or the seam, he felt the weight of it, the way the fabric yielded to the touch. The hum in his chest deepened, a sonorous frequency that seemed to resonate with the very timber of the barn walls, softening the sharp edges of Nia's precision. Together, they began to move. It was a wordless dance of heady fabric and soft breath. Nia worked with the efficiency of an engineer, her motions linear and certain, while Gunnar moved in curves. He followed her, smoothing the wool where she had laid it, his fingers trailing over the fibers to coax them into a more natural repose. The rustle of the wool was the only sound, a dry, shushing noise that blended with the deep, synchronized breathing of the sleeping cows. For a few minutes, the barn became a vacuum of shared intent, the two of them orbiting the livestock in a synchronized loop of indigo and shadow. Nia paused, her brow furrowed as she attempted to align the second blanket in a mathematically perfect grid. She knelt, using the edge of her hand to square the fabric against the wooden rail of the stall, her expression one of intense concentration. She was sculpting a fortress of wool, a rigid barrier against the encroaching winter. She began to tuck the corner with a sharp, decisive motion, aiming for a 90-degree angle that would satisfy the logic of her design. "It wants to breathe, Nia," Gunnar murmured, his voice a low, rough purr. He didn't move her hand away, but he placed his own over the fabric, gently guiding her wrist in a slow, curving arc. "The warmth doesn't like a straight line. It likes to curl. It likes to nest. If you lock it in a box, it will only try to find the leak. Let the wool fall where the animal leans." Nia stiffened, her fingers tightening on the indigo weave. The idea of an intuitive fold was an affront to her sense of order. She watched the blanket, then at Gunnar's calm, weathered face, and then back to the animals. She started to argue, her mouth opening to explain the thermodynamics of a sealed seam, but she was interrupted by a sudden orange blur descending from the rafters. Saffron landed with a soft thump, directly in the center of the meticulously aligned grid. The cat didn't just sit, she claimed. With a slow, deliberate blink of her amber eyes, Saffron began to knead the wool. Her paws moved in a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. Push, pull, sink, repeat, digging deep into the heavy fibers and dragging the blankets into a series of chaotic, cozy mounds. The perfect 90-degree angles vanished instantly, replaced by a landscape of soft peaks and deep valleys. Nia gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "The thermal envelope! Saffron, you've completely compromised the seal." Saffron responded with a short, melodic chirp and a vibration so deep it could be felt through the floorboards. She didn't move. She simply leaned her weight into the wool and closed her eyes, her purring becoming a physical force that seemed to pull the atmosphere of the room downward. Gunnar let out a soft, humming chuckle. "She has found the sweet spot. Look." Nia looked. She watched the way the wool had bunched under Saffron's paws, creating a thick, pillowy nest. She studied the cows beneath the blankets. They hadn't stirred at the cat's arrival, but instead, they seemed to sink deeper into the bedding, their flanks rising and falling in a slower, more profound rhythm. The air around the animals didn't feel like it was being trapped in a box. It felt like it was being embraced. Slowly, Nia's shoulders dropped. The tension that had held her spine rigid since she entered the barn began to dissolve. She reached out, not to correct the fold, but to touch the wool where Saffron had kneaded it. The fabric felt different now, less like a tool and more like a sanctuary. She abandoned the grid. She stopped calculating the ratios and simply let her hands follow the curve of the animals' bodies, layering the remaining blankets in soft, overlapping waves. She found herself mimicking Gunnar's rhythm, her movements slowing, her breath deepening. She wasn't measuring heat anymore. She was feeling the warmth as a living thing, a heavy, golden weight that settled over the barn. The result was a wrap that defied her previous calculations. As she stepped back, she realized the animals weren't just warm. They were submerged in a state of absolute velvet peace. The indigo wool looked like a frozen sea of comfort, and the heat radiating from the livestock was a palpable, humming presence. Nia turned to Gunnar, a small, surprised smile touching her lips. The two of them shared a look of quiet understanding, a mutual recognition of the beauty found in the imprecise. For the first time, Nia didn't feel the urge to straighten a stray piece of straw or align the edges of the blankets. She felt the weight of the silence, the way it wrapped around them like the wool itself. "It's different," Nia said, her voice now a soft, melodic whisper that barely disturbed the air. "I thought this was a place of work, a place of maintenance. But it's not, is it? It's a sanctuary." "The work is the sanctuary," Gunnar replied, his voice a low hum of agreement. He began to slowly polish his glasses with the gray wool cloth, his eyes half closed in contentment. Just as the stillness reached its peak, a scent drifted through the rafters, the warm, spicy aroma of cinnamon and toasted oats, wafting in from the farmhouse. It was a scent that promised tea in heavy mugs, pulling at their senses and signaling the end of their vigil. The barn felt completely sealed, a pocket of timeless warmth in the heart of the freezing valley. As they turned to leave, the heavy timber door of the barn creaked open with a sudden jarring scrape of wood on stone. A blast of freezing air sliced through the warmth, bringing with it a flurry of white crystals that danced in the sudden draft. Standing in the threshold was Farid. He was clutching his silver pocket watch in one hand, his knuckles white, his expression one of urgent clinical concern. He didn't look at the sleeping animals or the beautiful, chaotic layers of wool. He looked only at the watch, then at the two of them, his eyes wide with a precision-driven panic. Completely unaccountable for the loss of 3 minutes, not to mention the thermal leakage we're sustaining by leaving the main door ajar in a plummeting barometer. Farid's voice sliced through the velvet silence of the barn, a sharp, clinical blade that left the air feeling frayed. He stood in the threshold, the silver pocket watch held open like a shield, his thumb obsessively clicking the latch. The frost that had followed him inside clung to the wool of his coat in tiny, crystalline needles, and his eyes darted from the watch to the livestock, then back to the watch, as if the ticking could somehow reverse the atmospheric shift. Mia stepped back, her hand still resting on the indigo wool of the blankets. The sudden intrusion of urgency felt like a physical weight, a jarring dissonance against the rhythmic peace they had just cultivated. She watched Farid, noting the way his shoulders were hiked toward his ears, his entire body a coiled spring of logistical anxiety. He wasn't seeing the animals in their deep, honeyed slumber. He was seeing a series of missed benchmarks and inefficient intervals. To Farid, the barn was not a sanctuary, but a ledger of wasted seconds. Gunnar did not flinch at the outburst. He remained still for a long moment, the gray wool cloth still poised to polish his glasses. He watched Farid, not with irritation, but with a profound, patient sadness, the way one looks at a bird trapped in a room who keeps throwing itself against the glass. Slowly, Gunnar folded the cloth and tucked it into his pocket. He moved with a deliberateness that seemed to push back against the frantic energy Farid had brought into the room. Without a word of argument, Gunnar stepped forward. He didn't interrupt Farid's rambling about the thermal gradient or the suboptimal timing of the bedding cycle. Instead, he simply reached out and placed a heavy, warm hand on Farid's shoulder. The contact was grounding, a sudden anchor in the middle of Farid's storm. Gunnar's palm felt like a heated stone, radiating a steady, unwavering warmth that seemed to seep through the layers of Farid's coat and settle directly into the muscle. "The time is where it needs to be, Farid," Gunnar murmured, his voice a low, humming vibration that resonated in the chest. He didn't pull or push, he simply guided him, a gentle steering motion that directed the scholar away from the drafty door and toward the center of the barn, where the cast-iron wood stove glowed with a deep, subterranean orange. Farid stiffened, his internal clock screaming for a rebuttal. He tried to pivot, his gaze snapping toward the tool rack near the western wall. A set of wrenches sat there, slightly askew, their metal-sharp surfaces reflecting the dim light in a way that offended his sense of order. He made a sudden move to step toward them, a reflex to organize the chaos of the tools to quiet the chaos in his mind. But as he shifted his weight, he found his legs resisting. His boots felt as though they were sinking into thick, warm clover. The air around his ankles seemed to have thickened into honey. He blinked, confused by the sudden heaviness of his own limbs. He tried to lift his foot, but the movement was slow, languid, as if the very concept of haste had been erased from the room. He looked down at his legs, then back at Gunnar, who was still humming. It wasn't a song, but a sonic cocoon, a steady, enveloping drone that dampened the sharp edges of the world. The sound seemed to wrap around Farid's consciousness, softening the rigid lines of his panic and blurring the boundaries of his urgency. "I really must. The schedule is we are behind on the winterization logs," Farid began. But the words didn't snap as they usually did. The precise, clipped tones of the scholar were fraying. His voice dropped in volume, the sharp consonants rounding off into a slow, hesitant murmur. He found himself unable to maintain the volume of his previous indignation. The effort required to speak loudly felt immense, an unnecessary expenditure of energy in a room that demanded surrender. He allowed himself to be led toward the hearth. As he drew closer, the visual of the embers captured him. The fire wasn't roaring, it was a slow, rhythmic pulse of crimson and gold, the coals shifting and collapsing in a hypnotic, slow-motion dance. Farid stared into the heart of the stove, the orange light reflecting in his wide eyes. He felt a strange pull, a gravitational attraction to the warmth that made the silver watch in his hand feel suddenly irrelevant, a cold piece of metal that served no purpose in the presence of such primordial heat. He lifted the watch one last time, his thumb hovering over the glass. He studied the second hand, but the ticking no longer sounded like a countdown. The rhythmic click-click-click-click seemed to slow down, stretching out, syncing itself with the slow, deep pulse of the glowing embers. The time was no longer a series of deadlines to be met. It was a tide, flowing in and out with a patient, ancient regularity. The urgency that had driven him into the barn evaporated, leaving behind a hollow space that was quickly filled by the scent of cedar smoke and sleeping sheep. A sudden spark popped in the stove, a sharp crack that echoed through the rafters. In any other circumstance, Farid would have jumped, perhaps checked the stove for structural instability, or noted the inefficiency of the fuel burn. Instead, he didn't even flinch. His eyelids grew heavy, the muscles in his jaw finally unclamping. He felt a profound sense of release, as if a heavy cloak had been lifted from his shoulders, though in reality he felt heavier than he ever had in his life, a comfortable, sinking weight that anchored him to the earth. He leaned back against the rough-hewn timber wall, the wood cool against his spine, but the air around him sweltering and sweet. His grip on the pocket watch loosened, the chain slid through his fingers, and the watch dangled precariously, no longer a tool of measurement, but a mere ornament. He closed his eyes for a second. The orange glow of the fire still burned into his retinas, a warm brand of peace. Nia watched him from the periphery, her expression one of quiet fascination. She had seen the transformation, the way the rigid geometry of Farid's posture had collapsed into something organic and soft. She studied Gunnar, who was nodding rhythmically, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. The barn had reclaimed him. The slow rhythm of the valley had reached out and pulled the scholar into its current, dragging him away from the ticking clock and into the timelessness of the deep winter. Just as Farid's breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the sleeping livestock, a heavy shadow fell across the open doorway. The freezing air returned, but it didn't bring the frantic energy of Farid's entrance. Instead, it brought a scent of dried sage and old pine. A silhouette stood there, leaning gently on a carved birch walking stick, the figure framed by the swirling white chaos of the storm outside. Brynhild had arrived, her presence filling the doorway with a weight that felt older than the barn itself. She didn't speak immediately. She simply stood there, her heavy knitted shawl wrapped around her like a cocoon, her eyes scanning the room with a slow, discerning gaze. She saw the sleeping animals, the indigo blankets, the dazed scholar leaning against the wall, and finally, Gunnar. The silence that followed her arrival was not the empty silence of a void, but the heavy, expectant silence of a story about to begin. Chapter 4. Brynhild didn't wait for an invitation. She moved into the barn with the slow, inevitable grace of a glacier, her birch stick clicking once against the stone floor. In her left hand, she carried a heavy ceramic pot, the lid rattling just enough to release a sudden, thick cloud of cinnamon and toasted oats. The scent didn't just drift. It arrived like a physical embrace, wrapping around the group and pulling them closer to the center of the room. She set the pot on the rough-hewn table with a dull thud, the steam curling upward in lazy ivory spirals that mirrored the snowflakes dancing outside the doorway. "The wind is singing the old songs tonight," Brynhild said, her voice wispy and airy, reminiscent of wind filtering through dry pine needles. She began to ladle the porridge into wide, chipped stoneware bowls, the thick liquid plopping softly. "It is a night for the great quiet, a night where the world forgets it is spinning and remembers only how to breathe." Farid, still leaning against the timber wall, blinked slowly. He studied the silver pocket watch dangling from his fingers, the hands frozen in his mind's eye, though the ticking had long since ceased to matter. He opened his mouth to ask about the timing of her arrival, to inquire if there was a scheduled window for such a visit, but the cinnamon scent seemed to coat his tongue, smoothing over the sharp edges of his curiosity. He watched the steam rise, his shoulders dropping another inch as the warmth of the porridge began to radiate through the air. Gunnar stepped forward, his movements rhythmic and humming. He didn't speak, but he reached out to adjust the placement of a bowl, moving it a fraction of an inch to the left so it sat perfectly centered on a knot in the wood. He caught Brynhild's eye, and a silent communication passed between them, a shared, ancestral acknowledgement. It was the look of two guardians who knew the exact weight of a winter night and the precise amount of warmth required to keep the darkness at bay. Gunnar gave a slow, rhythmic nod, his glasses reflecting the orange glow of the dying fire. 50 years ago, Brynhild began, her voice dropping an octave, becoming a melodic thread that seemed to weave through the rafters. The snow did not just fall. It descended. It was the year of the great quiet. The valley vanished beneath a blanket of white so profound that the sounds of the village were smothered. You could have dropped a crystal goblet on the cobblestones of the square, and the sound would have been swallowed by the air before it reached the neighbor's fence. Nia leaned in, her head tilting. She reached out to touch the coarse wool of the blanket draped over the nearby sheep, her fingers tracing the weave. She felt the narrative pulling at her, a slow current that demanded she let go of her precision. The way Brynhild spoke wasn't just storytelling, it was an invitation to decelerate. The cadence of the words mirrored the slow blink of Saffron, who had migrated from the livestock to the foot of Brynhild's chair, kneading the rug with rhythmic, heavy paws. "We lived in the hush," Brynhild continued, her voice thinning, turning into a lullaby. "We learned that when the world goes silent, you can finally hear the earth dreaming. We sat for days in rooms like this one, watching the embers turn from red to gold to gray, listening to the house settle into the frost. We discovered that the most important work a soul can do in winter is to simply exist in a state of perfect, unhurried stillness. Farid shifted. The scholar in him stirred, a ghost of his former rigidity. Historically speaking, he murmured, his voice sounding distant even to himself, a weather event at that magnitude would have necessitated a logistical response from the municipality. The archival records of the valley should show a spike in grain distribution and emergency. He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he let out a long, contented sigh that sounded like a balloon slowly leaking air. His eyes drifted shut, the historical correction dissolving into the aroma of cinnamon. He realized that the archives were cold, and the porridge was warm, and the warmth was currently winning. He leaned his head back against the wall, his body feeling less like a machine of productivity and more like a piece of driftwood floating on a calm, dark lake. As the fire subsided into deep, glowing coals, the narrative pace of the room slowed to a crawl. The only audible sound was the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the barn settling into the snow, a deep wooden groan that felt like the building was tucking itself in for the night. The atmosphere thickened, turning the air into something tangible, like a heavy velvet curtain that muffled the rest of the world. The room felt as though it were drifting, detached from the hillside, floating in a sea of indigo and amber. Nia felt a strange sensation in her chest, a loosening of the knots she always carried. She watched Gunnar, who had ceased his fussing. He was standing still, his hands folded, his breathing synchronized with the slow, heavy heaves of the sleeping sheep. The barn had become a sanctuary of absolute presence, where the past 50 years and the coming 50 hours merged into a single, shimmering moment of peace. Brynhild's voice had become a mere whisper now, a vibration that seemed to resonate in the bones rather than the ears. She had stopped stirring her porridge. The bowl sat forgotten in her lap. Her head began to tilt slowly to the side, her chin dipping toward the heavy knit of her shawl. The storytelling had exhausted her, or perhaps the peace she had summoned had finally claimed her as well. "The secret of the great quiet," she whispered, her eyelids fluttering, "is that the silence isn't an absence, it is a presence. If you listen long enough, the silence tells you exactly who you are when you have nothing left to do." With a final, soft exhale, Brynhild's eyes closed. Her grip on the birch walking stick loosened, and the wood leaned precariously against the arm of the chair. She drifted into a deep, sudden nap, her breathing becoming a slow, rhythmic tide that mirrored the livestock in the stalls. The transition was seamless, as if she had simply folded herself into the sleep of the house. Gunnar stepped forward with a ghostly lightness, his feet barely disturbing the straw. He didn't wake her. Instead, he reached for a spare wool throw, the one Nia had meticulously layered earlier, and draped it over Brynhild's shoulders with the precision of a jeweler. He tucked the edges around her, ensuring there were no gaps where the cold could seep in. Silence rushed back into the space, but it wasn't the empty silence Farid had feared upon his arrival. It was a thick, tangible quiet, heavy as a wet quilt. Saffron let out one final, vibrating purr and collapsed into a ball of ginger fur against Brynhild's boots. Nia and Farid remained still, caught in the gravitational pull of the elder's sleep. They sat in the amber dimness, 3 strangers and a guardian, bound together by the scent of cinnamon and the lingering echo of a story that had stripped away the need for clocks. Chapter 5. The silver snap of Farid's pocket watch sounded like a gunshot in the velvet hush of the barn. It was a sharp, metal-sharp finality, the sound of a gavel bringing a long, frantic trial to a close. Farid didn't look at the dial one last time. He simply pressed the casing shut with a definitive click and slid the instrument into the deep pocket of his waistcoat. His shoulders, which had been held with the rigidity of a frozen fence post since his arrival, finally dropped 2 inches. He let out a breath that sounded less like a sigh and more like a slow leak in a tire, his gaze drifting from the ticking clock of his mind to the soft, amber flicker of the wood stove. "I suppose," Farid murmured, his voice stripped of its usual clinical precision, "that the schedule for the remainder of the evening is now officially void." Nia leaned back against a bale of hay, her fingers still tracing the intricate weave of a wool throw. She didn't answer with words, only a slow, melodic hum of agreement that seemed to vibrate in time with the dying embers of the fire. The silence that followed wasn't the void Farid had feared, but a thick, insulating blanket. It smelled of old cedar, dried clover, and the lingering, ghostly sweetness of Brynhild's cinnamon porridge. In the dim light, the 3 of them sat like statues in a temple of warmth, while the sleeping elder remained draped in wool, her breathing a steady, rhythmic tide that anchored the room. Saffron had been watching them with narrow, amber eyes, gauging the atmospheric pressure of the room. The cat had spent the last hour calculating the exact intersection of heat and softness. Finding the peak of the environment's tranquility, Saffron rose in one fluid, ginger motion. There was no hesitation, no tentative approach. With a soft, resonant chirp, the cat launched itself through the air and landed squarely on Gunnar's lap. The impact was substantial, a heavy, warm weight that displaced the air in Gunnar's lungs for a fleeting second. Then came the purr. It wasn't merely a sound, it was a physical event. The vibration started deep in Saffron's chest and radiated outward. A low-frequency thrum that bypassed Gunnar's ears and went straight into his bone marrow. It felt as though a small, contented engine had been installed in his thighs. The rhythm was hypnotic, a steady, oscillating wave of contentment that seemed to synchronize with the very heartbeat of the barn. Gunnar felt his spine soften, the tension he always carried, the constant, hovering awareness of a stray piece of straw or a drafty corner, begin to dissolve under the weight of the ginger fur. As the purring intensified, a sudden, overwhelming wave of drowsiness crashed over Gunnar. It was a heavy, syrupy lethargy that turned his limbs to lead. He felt his eyelids grow thick, the edges of his vision blurring into a golden haze. For a moment, he fought it. The caretaker's instinct surged within him, a sudden spark of panic that whispered about the wood stove. The fire was banked, yes, but was it perfectly banked? Had he pushed the ash too far to the left? Was there a rogue ember threatening the hearthstone? And I cannot simply succumb, he thought, his mind suddenly spiking into a frantic internal monologue. The equilibrium of the room depends on my vigilance. If the fire dips too low, the temperature will drop 3 degrees, and Brynhild will shiver in her sleep. If the embers shift, the draft will pull the smoke back into the rafters. I am the sentinel of the warmth. I am the architect of this piece, and the architect cannot sleep while the structure is still settling. It is a dereliction of duty to drift when there is still a fraction of a degree of comfort to be gained. Just one more adjustment. Just one more check of the flue. I must stand. I must move. I must ensure the perfection of the sanctuary before I allow the darkness to take me. He attempted to shift his weight, intending to push himself up from the wool-lined chair. He braced his muscles to rise, but as he moved, Saffron responded with a sudden, possessive shift of her body. The cat didn't meow or protest. She simply melted, spreading her weight across his lap like a warm, living liquid, effectively pinning him to the seat. Saffron tucked her chin into the fold of his trousers and let out a long, vibrating sigh of absolute ownership. To move now would be an act of cruelty, a disruption of a perfect biological circuit. Gunnar froze, his half-risen torso hovering in a state of suspended animation. He watched Farid, who had closed his eyes and was leaning his head against the rough-hewn timber of the wall. He studied Mia, whose breathing had slowed to a rhythmic, meditative pace. The struggle within him, the war between the need to be productive and the irresistible pull of the stillness, reached a breaking point. The tension snapped, not with a bang, but with a slow, melting surrender. He realized then that he had been searching for the thermal sweet spots of the barn for years, treating it as a coordinate of air and insulation. He had looked for it in the layering of the straw and the sealing of the windows. But as Saffron's purr resonated through his ribs, he understood that the sweet spot wasn't a place. It was this exact moment of shared, motionless kinship. It was the cessation of the need to fix. Gunnar let his head sink back against the chair. He stopped fighting the heaviness in his limbs and allowed his breathing to sync with the rhythmic vibration of the cat. The world narrowed down to the scent of wool, the dim amber light, and the steady, thrumming heart of the ginger cat. He felt himself drifting, floating away from the shore of responsibility into a sea of velvet gray. The boundaries of his own body seemed to blur, merging with the warmth of the chair and the heat of the stove. He was no longer the guardian, he was simply a part of the barn's slow, winter respiration. Just as the first veil of true sleep descended over his eyes, a sharp, sudden sensation sliced through the warmth. A thin, icy needle of air struck the back of his neck, a cold draft that felt violently out of place in the curated sanctuary. It was a precise, freezing current that smelled of raw snow and midnight wind. Gunnar's eyes snapped open, the drowsiness vanishing instantly. He didn't move his head, but he felt the sudden drop in temperature ripple through the room, a ghostly finger tracing the line of his spine. Someone, or something, had left a window cracked, and the winter was beginning to leak inside. Liner 6. Gunnar didn't move his head, but he let his hand drift through the air, fingers splaying to catch the precise vector of the cold. It wasn't a gust, it was a surgical strike of frost, a thin ribbon of winter that had found a gap in the barn's armor. He shifted his weight, the old chair creaking in a slow, wooden groan that seemed to echo the heaviness of his own limbs. Beside him, Saffron had not stirred, the cat's flank rising and falling in a rhythm so steady it felt like a heartbeat for the room itself. Gunnar looked toward the small, high window where the velvet curtain had slipped, leaving a sliver of glass exposed to the midnight air. The moonlight hitting that gap was a bruised, clinical white, slicing through the amber warmth of the stove like a knife through butter. He rose with a deliberate, humming slowness, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium of the others. Farid was slumped against the timber wall, his silver pocket watch finally silent in his waistcoat, his face softened by a sleep so deep it looked like a surrender. Nia had curled into a small, thoughtful knot on the bench, her fingers still resting lightly on the weave of a wool throw, as if she were counting the threads in her dreams. And Brynhild the elder sat like a carved piece of driftwood, her breathing a wispy, airy sound that blended with the distant sigh of the wind. Gunnar felt the responsibility of the silence pressing against him. To move too quickly would be to shatter the glass of this moment. His arm felt heavy, as if he were moving through honey, as he reached for the velvet curtain. The fabric was thick, a deep midnight blue that swallowed the light. As he gripped the edge to pull it shut, he noticed a single, stray frost crystal had bloomed on the inner ledge of the window frame, a delicate, jagged star of ice that looked like a warning. The winter wasn't just knocking, it was trying to map the interior. With a slow, steady tug, Gunnar sealed the gap. The velvet fell into place with a muted thud, and the surgical strike of cold vanished instantly. The room seemed to exhale, the temperature stabilizing into a thick, enveloping warmth that felt almost liquid. He lingered there for a moment, his hand still resting on the heavy fabric. The silence of the barn had changed. It was no longer a void waiting to be filled, but a presence in its own right. He looked back at the wood stove, where the fire had retreated from a roar to a series of soft, orange pulses. The embers were breathing, glowing with a dim, rhythmic intensity that cast long, gentle shadows across the floor. The shadows stretched and contracted, mimicking the slow respiration of the sleeping livestock in the stalls. The scent of burnt birch and old wool hung heavy in the air, a fragrance that tasted of safety and ancient, unhurried things. "The great quiet?" Brynhild murmured, though her eyes remained closed. Her voice was a dry rustle, like pine needles shifting under a light footfall. "It has a way of finding the cracks, doesn't it, Gunnar?" "I've closed it, Brynhild," Gunnar replied, his voice a low, humming murmur. "The cold is outside where it belongs. The warmth is here." Brynhild let out a soft, airy chuckle that didn't quite wake her. "The warmth is never just in the stove, little guardian. It's in the leaning. Look at them. They aren't just sleeping. They are leaning into one another. That is the only insulation that truly holds." Gunnar stepped back, his rhythmic, gentle nodding beginning as he observed the scene. He saw the way Nia's shoulder almost touched the edge of the bench where Farid rested, a bridge of proximity that bypassed their differing philosophies of order and intuition. He realized then that his obsession with the straw, the precise layering, the exact depth of the bedding, the constant fussing over a single stray piece of hay, had been a distraction. He had been trying to build a fortress of material comfort, but the true perfection he had sought was this, the shared surrender of 4 strangers and a cat to the gravity of peace. The perfection wasn't in the straw, it was in the trust. He moved back to his chair, his movements fluid and unhurried. As he sat, the boundaries of his own body seemed to blur. The amber light of the fading embers began to dissolve into a velvet darkness, a gradual transition that felt less like the loss of light and more like the arrival of a soft blanket. The room became a cavern of charcoal grays and deep indigos. He could no longer see the exact line where the floor ended and the shadows began, or where his own wool stockings met the grain of the wood. He felt himself merging with the architecture of the barn, becoming another beam, another layer of insulation in the great, slow machine of the night. Above them, the sound of the world shifted. The wind, which had been a sharp whistle, turned into a heavy, muffling thrum. It was the sound of snow piling up on the roof in great, wet sheets, layering themselves in a thick, insulating crust. The noise was a paradox, a heavy sound that created a deeper silence. It felt as though the entire farmstead was being tucked in by the mountain, the weight of the snow pressing down to seal them away from the rest of the world. The barn became a submarine of warmth, drifting through a sea of white, isolated, and absolute. Saffron, sensing the final descent into stillness, shifted his position. The cat climbed from the wool blankets to Gunnar's lap, his paws kneading the fabric of Gunnar's trousers with a rhythmic, slow precision. Saffron let out a long, vibrating purr that resonated through Gunnar's thighs and up into his chest. The purr wasn't a sound so much as a frequency, a low-end hum that anchored Gunnar to the present moment. It was the sound of a creature who had found the absolute center of the universe and decided to stay there. "Sleep now," Gunnar whispered, though whether he was speaking to the cat, the others, or himself, he wasn't sure. He felt a wave of absolute satisfaction wash over him, a feeling so dense it was almost physical. It was a low-frequency hum of contentment that blended into the silence of the barn. He thought of Farid's silver watch, now still and useless in the dark, and felt a flicker of warmth for the man's eventual release from the tyranny of seconds and minutes. He thought of Nia's hands, which had spent the evening weaving warmth into the world, and the way her breath now matched the slow pulse of the barn. The embers in the stove gave one final, dim flicker, a tiny orange spark that leaped and vanished, before fading into a soft charcoal gray. The last of the visible light retreated, leaving only the scent of cooling ash and the heavy, comforting smell of the livestock. The darkness was no longer an absence. It was a velvet weight, a gentle pressure that pushed them all deeper into their pillows and blankets. Gunnar closed his eyes. His final waking thought was not of the cold outside or the chores of tomorrow, but of the total, enveloping warmth of his companions. He felt the rhythmic breath of the barn, the slow expansion and contraction of a shared sanctuary. The world beyond the walls vanished, leaving only the silence of the Norwegian night and the deep, dreamless slumber of those who had finally stopped fighting the clock. As he drifted, he felt the snow continue to pile high above them, a white shroud of peace that ensured no one would wake until the morning light decided the stillness had lasted long enough.